Many thanks to REC Watches for sponsoring this video. In the skies above Britain and its allies during World War II, the instantly recognisable sight and sound of a Spitfire meant whatever you were doing, you at least weren't going to be doing it alone. And in the Battle of Britain, as the pilot corps of the RAF fought for their lives in the skies over their home country, they were joined by pilots from many nations, some allied, some neutral, some that had already fallen to the Axis advance. One of these pilots was Patterson Clarence Hughes, who had qualified as a pilot for the Royal Australian Air Force, but transferred to the Royal Air Force in 1937. Seeing action during the Battle of Britain first in Cornwall, his squadron was moved to the heart of the fighting in summer 1940, and Hughes quickly racked up victory after victory against everything from agile Bf-109s all the way up to the twin-engine German bombers. If I looked outside my window in 1940, I would most likely have seen his aircraft in the very skies that are above me today. Flying Spitfire X-4009, Hughes's career would come to an end on September 7th, 1940, when he claimed his final kill, a Dornier 17, with his aircraft going down immediately thereafter. Although he got clear, his parachute tragically failed to open. Years later, the wreck of X-4009 was recovered and has been moved to the Hunter Fighter Collection in Australia, who are restoring it to a flyable condition. However, some elements of the original airframe can't be reused, and REC Watches has been entrusted with this material, incorporating it into the subdial of each X-4009 timepiece. With the watch itself inspired both by the watches of the period that pilots would have worn and the Spitfire, you can find them available exclusively on the REC Watches website, link in the description below. And if you want to pick one up for yourself, you can also use the code DRAC, as well as the link below, to get yourself an additional 10% off. The Siege of Malta is a vast topic. Entire books, and indeed entire book series, have been written on it. And in future, I actually have plans to cover just the Malta convoys in their own little mini-series. So today can, of course, only be a very high-level overview, into which we'll dive considerably deeper in the future with any luck. This will, of course, concentrate on the naval efforts, and today we're going to be looking just at 1940 and 41, because, well, otherwise we'd be here much, much longer, and also the air campaign, and to a certain extent the campaign on land, are both entire topics to themselves, and also subjects I don't have anywhere near as much expertise in. So, first of all, some background. The island of Malta has seen human habitation for thousands of years, and has featured prominently in the politics and strategy of the central Mediterranean from a seafaring perspective for at least the last 3,000 of those years. Falling under the initial control of the Phoenicians at the start of that 3,000-year stretch, it was an important stopover for ships on the east-west trade routes between the Middle East and what would later become Spain and other associated areas in the western Mediterranean. It then came under the control of the Phoenician offshoot of Carthage, which then meant it was conquered and reconquered repeatedly during the various Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome, before eventually falling under long-term Roman control. When the Western Roman Empire fell, the island was once more overrun multiple times, initially by some of the invading armies, and then by the Byzantines, who were on a bit of a reconquest streak heading back west. In the late 9th century, it would then fall into the hands of the armies of Islam on one of their many attempts to take over southern Europe and its environs. A couple of centuries after that, it was then conquered by the Normans, who were a little bit displaced from northern France, but nonetheless, they incorporated it into the Kingdom of Sicily. For several hundred years after that, it passed through the hands of various European dynasties, surviving a series of raids and the occasional takeover attempt by the Islamic kingdoms and corsairs that were now based on the North African coast. But by the 1500s, Malta was becoming almost a frontline bastion as Ottoman expansion was steadily moving westwards. And the Holy Roman Empire Charles V decided that the best thing to do was to give the islands to the Knights Hospitaller, who'd recently lost their own base on the island of Rhodes, and in those days were a lot more about putting their enemies into hospitals or even beyond the care of them, rather than nursing people back to health. Although they did have that element to them as well. These days, of course, the Knights Hospitaller are focused almost exclusively on the medical side of things, but for over 250 years, from the decision of Charles V, They proved to be an excellent choice of guardians for the island, sending out numerous raids using their small but powerful fleet, which also contributed to a number of major naval engagements like the Battle of Lepanto, and famously, of course, they also repelled several large-scale Ottoman attacks, including one that, at least until World War II, would be the go-to campaign that people thought of if you said the Great Siege of Malta. This period ended when Napoleon, passing the island on his way to Egypt in 1798, decided it would make a fine addition to his collection. Although this lasted less than a year, before the Maltese rebelled, and the British, ever happy to help someone stick it to the French, showed up to help with the rebellion. Malta was then very briefly independent, but in 1800, given the whole Napoleonic Wars thing, they decided that living under British protection was a far better bet than going it alone, and they asked to join the British Empire. Although relatively useful as a central Mediterranean fleet base, Malta, and the Mediterranean as a whole, were not really a top priority for the Empire until the Suez Canal opened at the end of the 1860s. Then suddenly, Malta's ability to dominate the central Mediterranean became infinitely more important as the trade routes from Europe and most nations with an Atlantic coastline to India, and Asia as a whole, suddenly found themselves routed through the Mediterranean, and thus past Malta. The Grand Harbour naval facilities were then expanded, and the Mediterranean fleet became one of, if not the premier posting for British ships and officers outside of what was needed for the defence of the UK. Although there was also a large fleet base at Gibraltar, and eventually a small but growing base at Alexandria, Malta's location and defensibility meant that it was by and large the main base of Mediterranean fleet operations for a number of decades. But, as the 1930s wore on, Malta's position became increasingly volatile. Starting with the Abyssinian crisis, it was quite clear that the island would be an excellent base from which to thwart Italian ambitions in the Mediterranean, due to its proximity to mainland Italy as well as being close to most of the major supply routes that Italian forces would need to take if they wanted to reinforce their holdings in North Africa. But at the same time, that very proximity to Italy and Sicily now meant that the island was in range of the new and improved bombers that the Regia Aeronautica were fielding. And since the Royal Navy had been considering the finer details of exactly how vulnerable a fleet moored in harbour was to air attack for about 2 decades at this point, they quickly realised that a Mediterranean fleet based in Malta would probably suffer significant attrition from consistent bombing raids, and that a combination of air and potentially submarine attack could also compromise the logistics networks that would be needed to bring in the vast amount of fuel, ammunition, food, and various other supplies that the fleet would need to keep operational. There was also a plan in the 1930s to dig tunnels for an extensive underground submarine base that would be capable of supporting at least half a dozen submarines, possibly more, in an environment that was impenetrable to all existing forms of air attack, but these efforts would be cancelled while the base was incomplete on cost grounds. And so the Mediterranean fleet, as a whole, moved to Alexandria. Although the coastal defences of Malta were not significantly upgraded from their earlier Victorian and early 20th century editions, partly on the grounds of cost and partly because it was anticipated that any major naval invasion of the island would take long enough that the Mediterranean fleet could intervene, even if they didn't have advanced warning, and so it was decided instead to add more anti-aircraft guns, fighters, airstrips, and maybe even a few strike aircraft to help deal with any air threat. Specifically, the plans called for the installation of 112 heavy and 60 light anti-aircraft guns, 24 searchlights, or potentially searchlight batteries, depending on which document you look at, 4 squadrons of fighter aircraft, and a number of barrage balloons, aerial mines, and smoke generators. However, with the outbreak of World War II and the subsequent drawing in of resources to tackle Germany, most of these planned increases were relatively minimal, especially since Italy at that stage was neutral. And thus, in June 1940, when Italy declared war, the air defence of Malta stood at a single under-strength squadron of biplane fighters. And even then, they weren't technically supposed to be there. The small collection of aircraft was actually a bunch of leftover Sea Gladiators that were supposed to have been picked up by HMS Eagle, but had somehow been overlooked. Admiral Cunningham was happy to let Malta have them, and meanwhile, the naval presence was dominated mainly by a number of submarines and a few small warships, The monitor HMS Terror being the largest and most heavily armed surface vessel, she was expected to use her 15-inch guns as a mobile defence platform against potential naval raids, and her onboard anti-aircraft armament actually contributed significantly to the overall general defence efforts for the Grand Harbour, due to the aforementioned lack of upgrades to the general defences on land. Although the bombs started falling almost as soon as Mussolini declared war, one of the early major concerns was what would happen if Italy tried to launch an amphibious invasion. The Regia Marina had actually considered this in quite some detail in the run-up to World War II, but had decided not to go ahead with it for a number of reasons. Primarily, one, they'd have to build an entire amphibious landing fleet from scratch, and between potential defences and Malta's own often lethal coastline, they expected that they would lose almost every single one of these ships in the attempt, either being blown up by the defences before they hit the shore, or being wrecked beyond all hope of recovery by landing on the shore itself. Second, to ensure the safety of the troop movement, as well as to provide adequate fire support to suppress any defences, the entire available strength of the Regia Marina would need to be used. This, in turn, involved a huge risk, as it meant that a concerted attack from air, sea, or below the surface could then damage or destroy a large portion of the Italian fleet, especially if Gibraltar remained standing and thus the Gibraltar Straits remained open for the British to send in reinforcements, since an invasion would mean the Regia Marina would be stuck defending the landings and would not have full freedom to manoeuvre, something which they had designed into their fleet as quite an emphatic point, with their emphasis on speed, sometimes at the expense of armour. Of course, taking Malta would not in and of itself win the war, and thus crippling the Regia Marina by tying it to an invasion that was then hammered by the Royal Navy from two sides, even if the invasion itself actually ended up succeeding, would probably be a net negative for the Italian war effort. Third, thanks to British subterfuge and intelligence efforts, the Regia Marina wasn't sure exactly how strong or even where all of Malta's shore defences actually were, which raised further possibilities of any expedition being a costly failure. Fourth, any such operation would use a huge amount of fuel, and even in the early stages of Italy's involvement in the war, their fuel reserves were not unlimited. Regardless of whether or not the invasion succeeded, the ability of the Italian Army, Air Force, and Navy to conduct operations in the near future afterwards would likely be severely curtailed by a shortage of all sorts of fuel. Plus, of course, they would then need to expend large amounts of fuel constantly defending Malta, as the British would surely counterattack in some way. And so, as 1940 progressed, the Regia Aeronautica air campaign, while annoying, was having a more limited impact than had been initially feared. Supply ships generally were making it through, although Operation White, the second major effort to get more fighters to Malta, actually failed in late 1940 when the presence of an Italian battle squadron caused the fighters to be launched early, with many of them thus not making the trip and being lost at sea. The naval side of things, as far as Malta was concerned during that year, could broadly be divided into two sections. In terms of offensive actions, the only force that Malta really had at its disposal was a loose group of submarines who would subsequently be stood up as the 10th Submarine Flotilla. Unfortunately, their initial efforts, while somewhat successful in sinking Italian shipping, came at a relatively steep cost, as most of the submarines they had available were large types like the T-class, which had spent most of their time pre-war based in Singapore, preparing for long-range offensive missions against the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the close, clear, and very confined waters of the Mediterranean, the relatively large T-class submarines were much easier targets for Italian aircraft and ships, and also had a nasty habit of running into mines, which of course the closed waters didn't help because it was much easier to block out large portions of the Mediterranean with minefields than it would be to block out large sections of the Pacific. Although it was found that the limited number of smaller, nimbler and faster diving U-class submarines that were available had a much better survival rate, and so as the year closed out and more of these smaller submarines arrived, the surviving larger subs were generally speaking withdrawn for duties elsewhere that better suited their operational capabilities. On the surface, it can sometimes be difficult to link naval actions specifically with Malta in some cases, since of course there was an awful lot of naval activity near the island that had far more to do with supplying or interdicting Axis troops in North Africa than any attempt to attack Malta itself. But the actions that have at least a tangential relationship to the island include the following. The Battle of the Espero convoy. While strictly speaking this was an interception of Regia Marina destroyers heading for North Africa, the reason that the Mediterranean fleet's light cruisers were in the area in the first place was because they were covering empty convoys heading away from Malta, and reconnaissance aircraft from Malta spotted the Italian forces. This engagement, which I've covered in previous videos regarding destroyer and cruiser actions in World War II, resulted in the loss of the Italian destroyer Espero in the immediate action, with an Italian submarine being found and sunk shortly after by some Allied destroyers who'd been drawn to the action, with another Italian destroyer and 2 merchantmen being sunk with other ships damaged in subsequent air attacks on Italian ports in North Africa. Then there was the Battle of Calabria. Known mostly for Warspite's famous long hit on Giulio Cesare, this developed largely due to an Italian convoy heading for North Africa with a very strong escort, following mistaken reports of a significant force of British cruisers being based in Malta. This then ran into a heavy British escort force that was trying to ensure that an Allied convoy from Alexandria reached Malta successfully. Mutual intelligence and air reconnaissance reports meant that the heavy forces on both sides detached from their convoys and met each other in battle. Although in the end both convoys actually made their way to their destinations, and outside of a handful of hits, the battle as a whole was relatively indecisive. Although it has to be said the Regia Marina was the side which withdrew from the action. Then there was Operation Hurry. This was the first of many club runs, where aircraft would be loaded on to aircraft carriers, sailed into the Western Mediterranean from Gibraltar, and then flown off to Malta. Various carriers were involved. In this particular case, it was HMS Argus who dispatched a dozen Hurricanes. With the assistance of some diversionary raids conducted by elements of Force H, along with a pair of 2-seat skewers who came along to serve as navigation guides and as a source of spare pilots, along with a pair of Sunderland flying boats for air-sea rescue which were also loaded with more spare parts and ground crew, the operation was broadly successful. Further spares would also be sent in via submarine later on. Then there was the action of Cape Passaro, or Passaro, depending on your spelling, which took place as Royal Navy forces were once again trying to escort convoys to and from Malta, while the Italians used a mixture of destroyers, torpedo boats, and Mars boats to try and stop them. In a night action, the British used radar to their advantage, sinking 2 of the Italian torpedo boats, with a damaged destroyer then being finished off the following day. The attack on Taranto itself was not strictly related to Malta, except for the fact, of course, it aimed to disrupt the availability of the Italian fleet, which then technically would be less capable of launching a landing on Malta. But the main reason that that's a relevant operation is because it was part of a much larger series of operations, which included a convoy heading to Malta and another one of empty merchant ships heading away from it. Operation White, the second club run, was, as we mentioned earlier, largely unsuccessful owing to the decision to launch considerably sooner than expected due to reports of an Italian battle force in the area. Even so, there was just enough range on paper for the Hurricanes to make it, but a strong headwind sapped their fuel reserves, and 2 Hurricanes from the first wave ditched about 50 miles from Malta, with only 1 pilot being rescued by the accompanying Sunderland. The second wave of Hurricanes, although launched slightly closer to Malta, ran into a far stronger headwind and also made a number of navigational errors, and that ended up with all 6 running out of fuel before they spotted land. The Battle of Cape Spartivento was fought specifically due to an Italian attempt to intercept a major convoy that was heading to Malta, although the heavy escort forces provided by the Royal Navy managed to hold off the Regia Marina forces despite being outnumbered, and so the convoy would successfully make it through. Subsequent attacks on the convoy by Italian torpedo boats and Mars boats likewise experienced little success. There were, of course, other convoy efforts, but I've only briefly covered the incidents where actual naval action resulted, as opposed to general convoys which passed with nothing much more exciting than the occasional bombing raid. On Malta itself, during the course of the year, as well as more fighters, some photo reconnaissance aircraft had shown up in September. These were a welcome addition, not just to keep closer tabs on what the Regia Marina was doing, but it also actually allowed freer use of growing British signal intel capabilities. since sending out a reconnaissance aircraft or two on a prescribed course guided by intelligence could then lead to the accidental discovery of Italian forces at sea, who would then not really question anything other than their poor luck when British submarines or surface forces attacked them shortly thereafter. But as 1940 turned into 1941, things began to take a decided turn for the worst. Thanks to the failures of the Italian army in North Africa, the Germans decided they were going to get involved. This meant that the amount of Axis supplies heading from Italy to North Africa would have to grow quite rapidly, and that meant that the Axis needed to protect those supply runs far more vigorously. And the Luftwaffe decided that as well as trying to hunt down Royal Navy ships at sea, they would also go after Malta in a much increased way, partially because of the submarines and the occasional light warships that were based there, but also because they were aware that if the island was left largely unmolested, then its aircraft and vessels in the harbour might grow in number, not only such that the fighters and anti-aircraft guns would provide more than adequate defences, but also squadrons of strike aircraft and even more reconnaissance planes might be based there, which would further hinder Axis shipping efforts. Due to the relative lack of aircraft on Malta, which still amounted to only some Hurricanes and a few remaining Sea Gladiators, most of Fliegerkorps 10 was initially made up of attack aircraft of varying types. Their assault kicked off barely a handful of days into January when a major convoy was inbound to Malta, and having identified the carrier Illustrious as one of the escorts and rather keen to remove it from the board, in large part because of its starring role in the Taranto raid in late 1940, the Italians and the Germans devised a complex and multi-layered plan to sink it. Although Illustrious proved to be remarkably tough and failed to sink despite suffering numerous hits, she was damaged quite badly, and set course for Malta, which happened to be the nearest friendly naval base. A follow-up attempt to find and finish off the carrier resulted instead in the dive bombers coming across and then fatally damaging the cruiser Southampton, but then the Germans noticed Illustrious undergoing frantic repairs in the Grand Harbour, and scores of bombers began attacking pretty much daily, trying to ensure that the carrier never sailed again. Malta's fighters put up enough resistance that some of this strike effort was actually diverted to hitting the airfields to try and keep the defenders occupied, but despite scoring another hit on the carrier, along with several near misses, the dockyard repaired the damage faster than it could be inflicted, and after nearly 2 weeks of constant bombardment, Illustrious made it back out to sea, heading for the US via the Suez Canal for further and more comprehensive repairs. With Messerschmitt Bf 109E7s now escorting further Luftwaffe raids, the fighters based on Malta began to lose aircraft almost as fast as new ones could arrive, as worn-out Hurricanes were not really that much of a match for the most modern German single-seat fighter then in widespread service. The Bf 109F was technically in service, but it was only just getting up to strength in numbers at this stage, and that deployment was occurring in other combat theatres anyway. Despite the increasing air attacks, in April a number of Mediterranean fleet destroyers and a couple of cruisers were dispatched to base themselves at Malta for the purposes of interdicting Axis supply lines. Although they had some success, they were called over to the Battle of Crete along with most of the Royal Navy's assets in the Mediterranean in late May. The losses inflicted on the Navy there, as well as the needs of the reduced main Mediterranean fleet force, meant that surface strike forces in Malta would then have to wait some time to be spun up again. The Axis, of course, did their best to oppose this, with major air raids during this period badly diminishing the capabilities of the dockyard. However, by the end of April, the attacks dropped off notably. This was because the Germans had decided to get involved in the invasion of Yugoslavia, and were also building up for Operation Barbarossa, which would be launched subsequent to that, which, between them, drew off most of the strength of Fliegerkorps 10, leaving a battered Malta to the attention solely of the Regia Aeronautica, or near enough. This allowed the strength of the defenders to expand, especially as a number of convoys succeeded in making it in. By summer, almost 200 aircraft, including several squadrons of strike aircraft, were now available. The fighters included newer models of Hurricanes with significantly better performance and considerably heavier armament, plus there were a number of twin-engined aircraft, such as Beaufighters, which were mainly present for attack missions, but could also put in a fairly good shift against the Italian 3-engine bombers if needed. Further cheer was to be found at the end of July when the elite 10th Flotilla, or Decima Mass, the Regia Mariner's Special Ops Forces attempted a Mars boat attack on the naval and transport infrastructure of Malta, but thanks to the attackers being spotted coming by radar, most of the attacking craft would be destroyed at the expense of one bridge. Thanks to the lull in effective bombardment, a combination of aircraft and submarines based out of Malta began to take big chunks out of the Axis supply convoys, and surface units returned in the form of Force K in November. But December saw the return of the Luftwaffe in a major way, which, combined with a string of successes by Axis minefields and the first major surge of U-boats into the Mediterranean, started to swing the tide back against Malta as 1941 turned into 1942. So, looking at the major engagements of 1941, at least in the naval terms, linked to Malta, the club runs, of course, continued, with at least one club run every month from April through to November, plus the larger twin-engined aircraft flying themselves in from land bases, since they had the range to do that. April and September saw 2 club runs, and June saw no less than 4, with each operation generally sending between 2 and 4 dozen Hurricanes over, most of which would make it, and July and October seeing torpedo bombers being sent in instead. Operation Excess in early January, apart from seeing illustrious damage as we've covered earlier, was designed to cover a large number of convoys that were being moved around, including 2 inbound supply convoys for Malta, one coming from Alexandria, the other from Gibraltar, with another outbound convoy from Malta that was heading to Alexandria. Although the hits to Royal Navy warships, including the carrier, were not exactly great for the Royal Navy, the merchant ships themselves actually made it through without much issue, which greatly boosted the defences and supply levels of the island. Due to the operations involving Greece, most of the early part of the year would see naval combat primarily concerned with that area, and so the next major Malta-related action would be the Battle of the Terrigo Convoy, which I've also covered in one of the destroyer and cruiser action videos. This involved a number of destroyers based at Malta intercepting an Italian supply convoy that was heading for North Africa, resulting in the complete destruction of the convoy, which consisted of 3 destroyers and 4 merchant ships, in exchange for 1 destroyer sunk by a lucky, or unlucky, I suppose if you're that destroyer, torpedo hit. Operation Substance in July saw a major convoy from Gibraltar to Malta attacked by Italian aircraft and light forces. Although they managed to sink a destroyer and damage a couple of other warships, and 2 merchant ships, the supply convoy reached Malta, including all the damaged vessels, which significantly boosted the island's defences as many convoys also brought in crated aircraft, as aircraft attrition ran higher than pilot attrition, and so the pilots who'd flown in the club runs could be allocated fresh aircraft when theirs were either shot down or otherwise written off. The raid on the Grand Harbour by the Italian 10th Mars Flotilla, as mentioned earlier, happened at the end of July, but it ended up costing the Allies only a bit of ammunition, 1 fighter, and the bridge, at the cost of a dozen of the attack boats and 2 Maiale manned torpedoes. Most of the lost vessels were destroyed, but a few were also captured. Most of the damage was done by the alerted shore defences using various lighter guns, primarily 6-pounders, but a few more of the Mars boats were caught and destroyed by Hurricanes the following morning, who chased them down as they retreated. Due to then operations around Crete, there was subsequently relatively little again in terms of major action related to Malta, at least at sea, until Operation Halberd in late September. This was another supply convoy heading from Gibraltar to Malta, with a substantial escort, but with near equal Italian forces sailing out in opposition along with considerable air power. Although the Italian forces only lost a submarine and a couple of squadrons of aircraft, they managed a single torpedo hit on the battleship HMS Nelson, which survived, although with the very sad loss of a very good cheese that was being stored deep in the hold, but they also managed to inflict mortal damage on the cargo ship Imperial Star, which was eventually scuttled to allow the rest of the convoy to maintain speed, taking with her 8,000 tons of vitally needed cargo, although her crew and the 300 troops that were aboard were all rescued. In November, Force K, based in Malta, attacked the Duisburg, or Beta, convoy as it headed for North Africa. All 7 of the Italian merchant ships were sunk in yet another radar-guided night action, despite the attacking forces being only a pair of Arethusa-class light cruisers and a pair of destroyers, compared to the 10 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers assigned to cover the convoy. Using the cover of night, their own radar, and judicious use of jamming, the cruisers managed to sink the destroyer Fulmine and damage several others, blowing a gap in the convoy's escort screen that allowed the British destroyers to get in among the merchant formation, along with supporting fire from the cruisers. Thanks to the jamming, the Italian heavy cruisers and their own escort were then led on a merry chase as they headed after outdated contact reports, with the British also then making skilled use of the glare from the fires and the concealing nature of the smoke from those fires to hide themselves when the heavy cruisers finally caught up with them and opened fire. Another Italian destroyer would be sunk by the submarine Upholder as the remaining Italian escorts fell back the next day since, well, there wasn't a convoy to escort anymore. And finally, in December, the First Battle of Sirte took place as Admiral Vian tried to get a convoy from Alexandria to Malta. At this stage, the Mediterranean fleet could only spare some light cruisers and destroyers for the mission, and as with a number of other battles, this encounter was the result of convoys from both sides operating at the same time in roughly the same area. And thus, the Italian formation significantly outgunned Vian's force, whose largest ship was the Leander-class light cruiser HMS Neptune, whereas the Italians had a battleship. The Regia Aeronautica failed to inflict any real damage, and Vian then managed to use a combination of smoke and fast torpedo runs, some fake and some real, to keep the Italian forces at bay until nightfall. And with the fall of darkness, the Italians chose to withdraw rather than risk another night action with the Royal Navy when the British had radar and the Regia Marina did not, since at this point they had already fought the Battle of Cape Matapan and weren't keen to repeat the experience. Although the Malta-bound convoy was then able to get their supplies to their destination, the escort force subsequently ran into an Italian minefield, resulting in the loss of the Neptune, as well as the destroyer Kandahar, plus damage to the cruisers Aurora and Penelope. And that wraps up Malta's defence from a naval context for 1940 and 41, and at some point later this year, hopefully we'll take a look at 42 and 43.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.